Can contraception ever be morally permissible? Let's take a closer look. As we've already seen, Catholic teaching answers this in the negative. Here we take a closer look at arguments for and against, many of which you may already be familiar with. We'll start once again with what I call the philosophical level of the debate. As we've seen, the Church states that we can appreciate using our reason alone that freely chosen sexual activity must be fully unitive and procreative. Therefore, the Church concludes we can see using our reason alone that contraception is morally wrong. However, others disagree. So one common objection, for example, is that it's not self-evident that each and every instance of freely chosen sex must be fully unitive and procreative. Rather, they claim that as long as the marriage on a whole is open to procreation, it's okay to use contraception in certain instances. How might a Catholic who upholds Church teaching respond? Well, as Catholic bioethicist Nicanor Austriaco says, we can't just dismiss individual acts like that, since they are very morally significant. Each and every act we engage in shapes us and helps us either toward or away from eternal happiness. Just as a single act of stealing or adultery is morally wrong, so too is a single act of contraception, Austriaco says. A related line of attack, still here an argument proceeding from reason alone, is to argue that the Church itself thinks it's okay to act against procreation, since it permits the use of NFP to avoid pregnancy. Now, we began to discuss the distinction between NFP and contraception before. I'll go into a little bit more detail here. So more specifically, the objection is, since both NFP and contraception have the same intention to avoid pregnancy for good reasons, if the first one is okay, the second one should be okay too. That's the objection. Austriaco, again, disagrees, however. And what he seems to say is that while the intention in the two cases, NFP and contraception, is indeed okay, it can be good, the object in the case of NFP, abstaining from sex during the fertile times and having fully self-giving sex during the infertile times, that object's fine, but the object in the case of contraception, rendering a fertile act infertile, is bad, so the entire act is bad. The words of Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae can also be seen as relevant here. Quote, "To experience the gift of married love while respecting the laws of conception is to acknowledge that one is not the master of the sources of life, but rather the minister of the design established by the Creator." End quote. So again, what the Church is trying to do here is to draw a distinction between NFP and contraception by saying that NFP involves being the minister of God's design, cooperating with God, not interfering with nature. Whereas on the other hand, the claim is that contraception is, trying to sort of take that power from God in a way, or trying to be the master of when life begins, and that is inappropriate. Okay. So this all goes to kind of the philosophical groundings for Church teaching. Another level the debate takes place on is what we can call, once again, the practical level. And as I did at the outset of my talk, I tried to emphasize that in Catholic teaching there is a relationship between morality and happiness. Doing the right thing is actually in our own interests as well. And so the question I want to address here is related. Does using NFP to avoid pregnancy rather than contraception, does that actually benefit the spouses themselves, make them happier? On this level, too, we use arguments based on reason alone, without yet appealing to the authority of religious sources. But we can appeal to one such argument that does happen to appear in a religious source, once again, Humanae Vitae, which was issued in 1968 in response to widespread disagreement by the Catholic faithful and professors and priests at the time as to whether using contraception could be moral. So Pope Paul VI affirmed that it could not be moral, and he appealed in part to some of these philosophical arguments we're talking about, wrong to have sex while ruling out procreation at the same time. But he also added some practical concerns here. Here's what he said in Humanae Vitae. He expressed the concern that if contraceptive use became widespread, it would lead to men using women as sexual objects and disregarding their, quote, physical and emotional equilibrium. And he added that ultimately this would lead to, quote, conjugal infidelity and the general lowering of morality, end quote. Many now say that Pope Paul was prophetic, since the divorce rate in this country, for example, is almost 50%, whereas the divorce rate of couples using NFP is only 2 to 3%. Now, let me ask you, actually, what do you suppose is causing this low divorce rate among couples who use NFP? There's a couple different possibilities. How would you articulate it?
I believe it's lower because of the fact that there's a lot more communication going on. And of course, communication is needed in any healthy relationship. So of course, you're talking about ovulation, you're talking about different ways you're planning things out for the month. So it's basically about communication.
Okay, yeah, and that's one thing I want to talk about. I think that's all right. We have a couple other thoughts in the back.
I was going to say, along those lines, I feel like if a couple were to use birth control as opposed to NFP, birth control basically puts it all on the woman, and it's like, oh, it's your problem, you deal with it. But in using NFP, the couple works together and, again, is in full communication with each other, so it's a unity thing.
All right, and you had a point as well?
Also, also with communication, the couple would also work intellectually, creatively, and emotionally as well to be able to decide whether or not to achieve or postpone a pregnancy.
Okay, yeah, I think that's kind of all on the right page, right? We have various forms of communication that use of NFP can promote, and that's one thing that certainly I think can be causing this low divorce rate. It could be the very fact that they're using NFP and that their marriage is spiritually healthier as a result. Another way to put it. Another possibility, maybe this is one of the factors, sometimes people point this out. Many and perhaps most couples using NFP are relatively religious, most largely practicing Catholics to begin with, who don't really believe in divorce, and therefore they're committed to making that work no matter what. I think one fair conclusion could be that the low divorce rate is due to both factors, the couple's religiousness, but also the many positive benefits of using NFP, some of which you've mentioned and some of which we'll also examine further in a bit. Okay, so therefore the reasoning would go, it's in couples' practical interest to use NFP, since it does, at least in some sense, maybe contribute to this lower risk of divorce. Okay, so what exactly are these benefits? Again, some of you articulated this well. NFP improves marital communication. Both spouses have to learn it in order for it to work. Both spouses have to work together on monitoring the woman's fertility signs as opposed to certain forms of contraception. And along those lines, interestingly, many couples have claimed that NFP actually improves their sex life. The idea here is that it creates a kind of courtship honeymoon effect. In other words, couples abstain during the fertile period, that's the courtship phase, and that waiting makes their sex during the infertile period that much more pleasurable. That's the honeymoon phase. Other benefits can also accrue. NFP is at least as healthy, and often more so, than contraceptives, precisely because it's natural and does not involve any artificial substances or chemicals that may cause allergies to break out or other harmful changes to the body, such as those, for example, that could be posed by the birth control pill. Moreover, we could mention that in today's environmentally conscious society, NFP is one of the greener forms of birth regulation, so to speak. Though condoms can pollute if they're improperly disposed, and the hormones in birth control pills can actually cause environmental damage and hazard to animal life when they are excreted and enter waterways. In contrast, regarding the benefits of natural family planning, Humanae Vitae, suggested that, quote, it brings to family life abundant fruits of tranquility and peace. It helps in solving difficulties of other kinds. It fosters in husband and wife thoughtfulness and loving consideration for one another, end quote. And that encyclical concludes that, quote, for man cannot attain that true happiness for which he yearns with all the strength of his spirit unless he keeps the laws which the Most High God has engraved in his very nature, end quote. Okay, so once again, trying to emphasize the relationship here between morality and happiness. At the same time, it's important to recognize that, that NFP is not always easy. It does take some time to learn, for one thing. Some may find, at least at times, the abstinence period to be difficult. But that said, the Church does hold that with patience, prayer, a mindset that does not completely reject procreation, and of course God's grace, any couple can find NFP possible and rewarding in the end, both in this life and in the next. And once again, we can cross-reference the words of Humanae Vitae here. Quote, "The teaching of the Church regarding the proper regulation of birth is a promulgation of the law of God himself. And yet there is no doubt that to many it will appear not merely difficult, but even impossible to observe. Now it is true that like all good things which are outstanding for their nobility and for the benefits which they confer on men, so this law demands from individual men and women, from families and from human society, a resolute purpose and great endurance." Okay, so maybe you could read this in other words to sort of acknowledge, NFP can be a challenge at times. Shouldn't shy away from that acknowledgement. Pope Paul VI continues, "Indeed, it cannot be observed unless God comes to their help with the grace by which the goodwill of men is sustained and strengthened. But to those who consider this matter diligently, it will indeed be evident that this endurance enhances man's dignity and confers benefits on human society." End quote. And Humanae Vitae later adds that couples can seek this grace that helps them to regulate procreation appropriately through recourse to prayer and the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist. So, those are some arguments for NFP and against contraception that you could use on the philosophical and practical levels. But once again, Christians will want to know what, if anything, the Bible has to say about these issues. Of course, the book of Genesis exhorts humans to be fruitful and multiply, which some take as implicitly frowning upon a contraceptive mentality. But does the Bible ever directly address contraception? Does anybody know the answer to that?
I would think it would be never permissible because just the object or the end to the means is not good.
Yeah, certainly according to the Church. Is contraception addressed in the Bible in particular? Okay, a lot of people shaking their head. There's certainly no obvious, knockdown, obvious examples that everybody would accept, but there's one possible passage that might address contraception directly, which I want to talk a little bit about. Maybe you've heard of this story already. Genesis chapter 38. A man named Judah has two sons, the older son, and Onan. Okay, so what happens here is marries Tamar, but then displeases God. The text doesn't say why exactly, and God takes his life. God is not pleased. Now, according to something called the law of Levirate at the time, Onan now has the duty to marry Tamar, his deceased brother's wife, in order to preserve his brother's line, such that any children that Onan and Tamar had would be considered heirs of So what happens is Onan engages in sexual relations with Tamar, but since Onan knew any resulting child would not be legally his, he, quote, spilled his seed on the ground. That's what we would call coitus interruptus today, for example. God gets mad at Onan and takes his life too. Now the question is, why exactly did God get mad at Onan? Well, there's two possibilities here. One is that God didn't like that Onan refused to obey this law of Levirate and have children for his brother. And apparently that is the dominant biblical interpretation today. That said, the traditional explanation is that God got angry at Onan in that he, quote, spilled his seed. In other words, that he engaged in a form of contraception. And in support of this idea, some have noted that Scripture elsewhere, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 9 to 10, treats the violation of the law of Levirate as a fairly minor offense. So where's all this going? In the end, Christians will want to take into account that there are certainly no direct biblical arguments in favor of contraception, and there's at least one potential direct biblical argument against it. As an interesting side note, Onan has been immortalized in our language through the term onanism, which can refer either to coitus interruptus or masturbation. So even though God took his life, he's lived on in, I guess, an unfortunate sense. Moving right along, as we've seen, Catholics and many other Christians will be interested in not just what the Bible says on a particular issue, but also tradition. And so let's see if anybody wants to hazard a guess at this. Would you say that 2,000 years of church tradition has more or less approved of contraception, or has it been opposed?
I would say it's opposed contraception. Only recently has contraception come to the forefront of the debates.
That's exactly right. The answer is that it's been very strongly opposed since the earliest centuries of the church. So in particular, many well-known theologians, both Catholic, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and non-Catholic, by the way, Martin Luther, John Calvin, they all firmly condemned contraception. And so as you pointed out, it's not until recently that you started to get some disagreement on this. In fact, it wasn't until 1930 that for the first time a major Christian body, the Anglicans, acknowledged at something called the Lambeth Conference that contraception might be moral, and even then, they said at the time, only in limited circumstances. So now, of course, opponents of church teaching will claim that this tradition should change since it's of men, not of God. But as we've seen, Catholics who support church teaching believe that God speaks to us through tradition on this issue and others, and that the continuous opposition of tradition to contraception is a sign of God's will. Finally, Catholics in particular will be interested, as distinct from other Christians, will be interested not just in arguments at the level of Scripture and tradition, but also at what I will call the magisterial level, or the magisterium level. One issue here is whether the Church has infallibly, in other words, without error, proclaimed against contraception. Some, like theologian John Kipley, think that repeated Church condemnations of contraception throughout history, both by popes in Humanae Vitae and otherwise, and bishops, have been so definitive that they arise to the level of an infallible teaching, even though the phrase ex cathedra hasn't been used. But Kipley adds that maybe this is somewhat moot, because he adds that even if the condemnation of contraception was not technically proclaimed infallibly, it has been taught in a sufficiently formal, frequent, and emphatic way, and so it must be followed with, quote, religious submission of mind and will by Catholics. Another common argument on this level is that the sense of the faithful, which as we saw is said to complement the magisterium, that indicates that the use of contraception is morally permissible. More specifically, the objection here is that since the universal sense of the faithful is infallible, and since most married Catholics use contraception and don't have a problem with it, it must be okay. But remember, according to Catholic teaching, the faithful are those who let their views be informed more by the gospel than by contemporary culture, reality TV shows or otherwise, and people who do not disagree with the Pope and bishops. Catholics supportive of church teaching on contraception maintain that those who disagree with the teaching are not on the same page as the Pope and bishops, and they're letting their views be influenced more by contemporary culture, and therefore do not count as the faithful for purposes of that infallible sense of the faithful. So therefore, conclude Catholics who support church teaching, those who disagree with the teaching on contraception are not infallible on this issue after all. And so, kind of in less technical language, the idea here being just because many contemporary Catholics are okay with it doesn't mean it's right. That would be kind of the point there.